Brittany? Excellent. All right. So for those of you who do not know, APSIA, which stands for the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, brings together the leading graduate schools around the world that specialize in the study of international issues. I want to offer a special welcome today to members of the audience from PISA, which is APSIA's Public and International Service Advisor Network. The PISA network is made up of over 800 faculty and staff in student-facing roles across more than 300 college campuses. And now I would like us all to welcome Bailey Preston, Michael Saffel, and Hannah Myers, the Boren Outreach team. Bailey will be speaking today about the Boren Awards, and both Michael and Hannah will be on hand for the Q&A to answer any of your questions that arise during the course of the presentation. There will be time for Q&A after Bailey speaks. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box, and I will get to them at the appropriate time. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to you, Bailey.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tracy. And thank you so much, Brittany, as well, for having us here again. It's always a pleasure to talk to the APSIA folks. So with that, I'm going to kick it right off and I'll start sharing my screen. If I could get verbal confirmation that everybody can see the presentation. Amazing. Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up. And I'll look here from time and time again because you guys are here on this screen and my presentation is here. So just FYI. But yeah, so we are the Boren Awards. We are a Defense, Language, and National Security Education Office initiative. And here at the Institute of International Education, that is where we administer the program. And before I actually get into the presentation, I do want to give a little bit of background information about Boren and how it started and how we got to where we are today. So it all starts back in 1991 with the passing of the National Security Education Act, which basically created the National Security Education Program, which is housed within the Defense Language and National Security Education Office. And it was all started by Senator David L. Boren of Oklahoma, who thought that, or who saw that there was a need for people within the federal government with critical language skills, right? He saw that there was this massive need, and Boren Awards was a way to kind of create a pipeline to fill that hole. So that's how Boren started. And that's how we got to where we are today, where we're trying to get students abroad to learn these critical languages to then come back and have a fulfilling career within the federal service. So that's all very important, and I'll talk about why later. And I'll throw the word national security around here and there. So just kind of trying to ping some buzzwords earlier so that you guys are kind of picking up on them when I do bring them up again. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. So eligibility, off the top, all students have to be U.S. citizens. They could also be naturalized. Unfortunately, green card applicants are not eligible, but U.S. citizens and naturalized folks are eligible. They have to be planning to study a foreign language intensively in an eligible world region. We get a lot of questions about Western Europe, especially Spain, France, Germany. That is not an eligible world region, right? We're looking at the underrepresented regions in study abroad, right? So it won't be Canada or Australia, New Zealand. Think Eastern Europe, so places like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, places like that. Students also have to be matriculated at an accredited U.S. institution if they're an undergrad, or if they're looking into graduate school, they need to be applying to graduate school, and they have to be enrolled by the time that their Boren program would start. So for example, let's say I'm a rising senior, and I can't study abroad my last year of undergrad, but I am looking at graduate school and I'm hoping to go abroad in September of this year. So if I apply for September, I would have had to be enrolled in graduate school by the time September comes around. And this is different at every institution. There's no like one way that this works. So we highly recommend that as advisors, right, you advise your students to reach out to their study abroad office, also loop in their academic advisors, and kind of see how that would work in terms, or the academic record office, right? See how it would work in terms of them maintaining their student status. They don't have to take any classes, they just need to have active student status. And then the last part of it is that they cannot be a citizen of the country in which they wish to study. So This is where I like to use Michael because he uses himself all the time. He has 2 children, and they both have Colombian and US citizenship. So if they wanted to study in Colombia, they could not. They would have to pick an alternate destination. And also throughout this presentation, there will be like QR codes in the upper right-hand corner. You can scan those at any point and they'll take you directly to that section of our website for whatever slide I'm on at the time. All right, so now we can talk about funding amounts. So we have 2 kinds of awards. We have scholarships, which is for our undergrad students, and then fellowships for our graduate students. The funding amounts work based on, excuse me if you can hear those sirens, I live right next to the highway. But so funding works based on the amount of time that students are abroad or overseas. So maximum amount of time abroad gets them the maximum amount of funding. So if they do 25 to 52 weeks, that's about 6 months to a year. They get $25,000. If that's a little long, they could opt for a 12 to 24-week program that will get them half of that $25,000, so 12,500. And if they're STEM students, again, this is only specifically for undergraduate students. This is not available for graduate students. But if they're STEM, they can study for 8 to 11 weeks abroad and get $8,000. For our fellows, it's pretty much the same. Just again, they don't have that 8 to 11-week option, but they do have the opportunity to do a domestic summer program, and they can get an extra $12,000 for that domestic program. Um, I will say those that 25 to 52-week duration is the preferred duration. So we prefer for people to go abroad for that amount of time because it just allows for the maximum amount of language and cultural immersion. But we understand that people have time constraints. Academic timelines don't always permit that. So we do offer the other options. They just have to make sure that their application is competitive and kind of reflects the 25 to 52-week timeline in a short amount of time. So what does Boren cover? It covers their one round trip ticket that must be compliant with the Fly America Act. So that means that your students must leave the United States on a United States airline and they must return to the US on a United States airline. We get a lot of questions about people who maybe have to change flights on their way to their final destination. So, for example, someone who may go to Kazakhstan may have to change planes somewhere in France. They get on a French airline and then they fly the rest of the way to Kazakhstan. That's totally fine as long as they leave the United States on Delta, American, or something of that sort. Boren also covers program tuition and materials, overseas medical insurance, their lodging and food costs for time in country, local transportation, and visa fees and visa related travel. We do not cover passports, vaccinations, dependents. This is especially for our graduate students. We get a lot of questions about spouses, partners, sometimes children. We cannot cover the cost for their dependents to travel with them, so that would be an out of pocket cost. We also cannot cover personal travel or entertainment, US rent, or any other US bill like credit card payment or anything like that. We highly recommend undergraduate ROTC cadets and midshipmen to apply for the Boren Awards. They are very strong candidates, again, because of that commitment to national service, national security and federal service, excuse me. They can mark that in the application. Same thing for veterans. They have a high acceptance rate, again, because of that commitment to national security and federal service, which they have shown by, serving in the armed forces. So next are our country preferences. This is just kind to give everyone an idea of where Borens can go. So countries in green, those are eligible for travel. I know that China is green in this picture here. China was not eligible for travel for the 2024 application. However, we leave it green because every year it is reviewed by Delencio, and there's always the opportunity that China may become eligible for travel, but all countries are reviewed every year. So that's why China is green in this case. Those countries in blue are not eligible for travel. If you have a student that is interested in traveling to one of those countries, let's use Russia, for example, they can apply for Russia. However, they will need to have a viable alternative plan in another country, appropriate for the same language of study. So, for example, if someone wants to go to Russia to study Russian, they need to have a viable alternative backup program in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, in Latvia, something like that. Um, and also, just another note for people studying Arabic, Mandarin, or Russian, they also just have to have a viable alternative plan in another country, again, for the same language, whether or not they choose one of those countries in blue or not. And this is just to kind of make sure that they have a backup plan in the event that, right, any of these countries do not become eligible for travel after the review process. And in those countries in yellow, they are not necessarily off the table. They're not preferred, but they're not off the table. And so students can apply for those countries. They just have to have a really, really strong argument and application for why they want to travel to those places. Um, and that's essentially it. And then next we have our language preferences. We have a more extensive list on our website. All African indigenous languages count. Um, and then you also see that Haitian Creole is on this list. We haven't sent anyone to Haiti in a few years. So Haitian Creole may not be the most viable option. However, it's still a preferred language. And then a note about French is that it's only preferred under the African Flagship Languages Initiative, which I'll talk about later. Students can still study French outside of that program, but they just won't have that preferred status attached to the language. And then similar note about Spanish. Spanish is also not a preferred language, just because a lot of people speak Spanish nowadays. That does not mean that students can't apply for Spanish. We have given out awards for Spanish in the past, but it is not as common as something like Portuguese or the indigenous languages like Quechua, Guarani, Maya, Miskito, or anything like that in Latin America. Um, so also just kind of keeping that in mind. And often what people do, if they have heavy Spanish background, they will study Portuguese or an indigenous language, because Spanish is kind of relevant and useful in both of those cases. And then these, I know this says fields of study preferences. We don't really have preferences. This is just more so of a general list of our most common majors. And so we have non-STEM, very common to see languages, poli-sci, international affairs. And then we're seeing a lot more STEM. So especially things like computer science, cybersecurity, biology, engineering, especially. Um, so these are just some examples of some common majors within. We're open to all majors. People think, well, Boren is a language program, so where would I fit in as a STEM student? And it's like you fit right in, right? We don't have any specific major requirements or even language proficiency requirements, right? Your student can be a complete beginner, they can be intermediate, they could be advanced. We just want them to go abroad and right get that overseas, that cultural immersion, that linguistic experience, and then to come back and give back to the federal government. So we have two kinds of eligible programs. The first is self-identified programs, and this is essentially where the student can choose their own adventure. They get to build their program and tailor it to their needs. And then those flagship language initiatives that I spoke about earlier, those are pre-structured programs where the student kind of cuts out all of that work where they have to find their own program and then make sure it meets the board requirements. They kind of just apply and then everything is already set up for them and then they get on their plane and they go have their fun. Um, so to talk a little bit more about the self-identified program structure, so it's just slightly different from Boren scholarships and fellowships, but it's essentially the same. So scholars and fellows, they can find their study abroad program either through their university study abroad office, through a third party provider like CIEE, CEA Kappa, something like that. Or they can look on our website where we have a list of programs that past Boren awardees have used. And these are kind of tried and true. We don't endorse these programs in any way, but these have been some of the most common ones throughout the history of Boren. And then, you know, really we're looking for scholars to just go abroad and learn the language. We're not expecting them to do any kind of research or anything like that. They can if they would like. They could also do an internship, but that is not an expectation. Same things for fellows. So again, either using one of those three options to find their study abroad program, and then which will be required. And then if they would like, they can incorporate some kind of academic study, an internship, or graduate research, because just again, we're cognizant of the fact that our fellows are often, they have timelines and things that they have to meet for their programs. So we try to give them a little bit more flexibility in terms of what they can incorporate. Again, it's all optional. It's only if they want to, but the option is there should they like to. So to kind of talk about a little bit more about our flagship language initiatives, these are open to all levels. Again, we don't have any proficiency requirements. For the athlete program, though, you do have to be intermediate high if they want to study French. And they will be tested to verify that they are that level, but generally it's open to all levels. It's fully funded and credit bearing. Your students will have to check with their institution to make sure that it transfers back. But they do receive credit. They do receive a transcript at the end of these programs. There are intensive small class study. They go with a cohort of other students that are learning their same language, and they have a summer course at a U.S. university, and then they have the fall course at an overseas institution, which also includes the local homestay. And then lastly, they have the option to extend into spring. This portion of the program will work similarly to how it works for self-design folks, where they have to find their own study abroad program. Some people have been successful in using the same one they used during the fall, but some people opt to use a completely different program. So it's just up to the student and what they would like to do. Um, and that's just a brief overview. More details about programmatic changes and structures, and availability for languages and countries and all that good stuff will come out sometime in August. So subscribe to our newsletter, stay tuned, so that you can get all those updates when they come out. And now we're getting more into the actual application. Um, so the first part is essays. Your students will have to write 2 essays, and I'll talk about each of those on the next slide. For scholars, they need letters of recommendation. They can have an optional third, but 2 is the requirement. For fellows, they need 3. Fellows and scholars could also opt to submit a language proficiency evaluation. This is optional. Ideally, this language proficiency evaluation is coming from someone that can speak to their level of proficiency within a language. And this is only something that can help a student. If they do not submit one, it cannot hurt them, because, again, we don't have that language requirement. But if you do have a student that has experience in a language, if they have a professor who is willing, ideally a language professor, or someone who has worked with them closely during their language journey, then they totally have the option to submit that language proficiency evaluation. Transcripts can be official or unofficial. They will need a study plan summary, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then for our fellows, they will need a research abstract, methodology, and a letter of affiliation from their overseas institution. So now we're going to talk more about the essays. So essay number 1 is all about national security. I threw that word out earlier. And what we're looking for here is for the students to explain how the country they want to go to and the language they want to learn is relevant to U.S. national security specifically. We define national security very broadly. So we've seen all kinds of arguments. We've seen people talk about public diplomacy. We've seen people talk about public health. We've seen people talk about cybersecurity. We've even seen some interesting arguments about dance and music and things of that sort. So there's not necessarily anything off limits. The most important thing is that it's authentic to the student, that their national security argument is clear. Want to make sure that they are not leaving anything up for debate, up for question, because the reviewers will not fill in the gaps, right? So it cannot be overstated that it should be as plain as day what their national security argument is, and it should be strong and authentic to them. And then essay number 2 is all about preparation to go overseas for an extended period of time, and then their future career plans for government service. So we're looking at, how are you getting ready? What are you doing? Are you doing something like Duolingo? Are you doing private tutoring? Are you, going to conversation tables, anything like that? And then also in that essay, right, we're hoping that they can talk about how, right, their interest in the language they're applying for in the country they want to go to, and also their background and their major, and any other experience they have, how they see all of that lining up and playing out somewhere within federal service. The advice we tend to give is that um, if they can go on something like USA Jobs, they can kind of look up, especially if they have something like an engineering major, cybersecurity, anything like that. Just type that in USA Jobs and see what positions come up. And if, they can kind of use that position to kind of base that second essay around. And that tends to be really helpful and kind of orient them a little better. Because, right, we're looking for people who have a long term dedication to federal service, not just folks who are looking to just receive this award and then, fulfill their year and then go on about their way out, right? Ideally, it's a long term commitment. And so, kind of like I said, this U.S. national security piece is explaining the relevance of the country language and or their field of study to U.S. national security. This is very broad and it can be analyzed in a lot of ways, but their argument should be detailed, specific, and related to their academic interests and their professional goals. And then the second part, the language and culture, this is their study plan. So this is demonstrating a serious commitment to language study before, during, and after Boren. You're looking to select programs, or your students are looking to select programs that maximize their opportunities for language immersion overseas. And they want to set realistic expectations for proficiency gains, right? Because we don't have that language proficiency requirement. We do have people coming into the program on all, you know, on all places on the scale of proficiency. You want to make sure that they have a realistic idea of what can happen in the amount of time that they are overseas. So we're not expecting someone who is a beginner in Mandarin or in Chinese to then come back from Taiwan fully professionally proficient in Chinese. That's not realistic. It's not an expectation we have, right? So just making sure that the program aligns with where they are. If they're a little bit more advanced, they could get away with some more courses in like history or things like that. Um, but ideally, right, looking to set realistic expectations. And then this last piece talks about that second essay about federal service. So again, Boren Awards alumni, they commit to working for the US government for at least a year. We do have that preference for folks who demonstrate a longer term commitment to federal service. We do offer educational deferments for folks that pursue further education because we realize that that's really important. And then, again, if you have a student who's, well, they've never considered federal service, or, they don't know anyone who's worked in federal service and they just don't really know where they would fit, we do have a list of on our website of where over 5,000 Boren awardees and alumni have fulfilled their service. So that's a good place to start. INSEPNet also, or the INSEP team, they also have a annual report that they publish every year, which has the same list and also some additional information about, service and things like that. And I could drop that link in the chat at some point later today. And so what's important to know is that when students um, write their essays is that there are priority agencies, and this is also helpful to know later on if they are awarded and as they begin to think about fulfilling their service. So we have priority agencies, and these are just agencies that have a very clear national security um, focus. So those four agencies would be Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, which also includes USAID, as well as the intelligence community. And then other agencies, which would be tier 2 agencies, these are places where other where Boren awardees also work. Some of the most popular are Department of Commerce, their commercial law development program. They love Borens. They hire a lot of Borens. Same thing for NASA. CDC is a very popular one among our STEM folks. And then also, Congress, USDA. These are also options for folks looking to apply to Boren and looking to fulfill their national security or looking to fulfill their federal service requirement. And in terms of job support and resources that come with being a Boren awardee, so a lot of people think that they work with IIE once they come back from overseas. They do not. They work with the National Security Education Program Service Team. That is a team of people specifically dedicated to help Boren awardees in the federal job search process. I used to be on that team. It's a great team. And so what the NSEP service team does is they try to create resources and opportunities for Boren awardees to find federal service. And so one of those resources is the job board, the NSEPnet job board. And this is something that your students can look at without even being a Boren awardee. They can apply to any of the jobs on there, but again, as they're writing that federal service essay, it's good to see what jobs Borens are being hired for, or, what jobs are being marketed towards them. And it may give them a good jumping off point for that for that part of the application. And so the job board again is only open to Boren awardees. So instead of like having to use something like USA Jobs as someone who is not in federal service, where anyone in America at any time could be applying for the same job, right? So your odds are anywhere from 1 in 1,000. That job board takes it from that 1 in 1,000 odd to maybe 1 in 100. So it's a smaller pool that you're working with when you're applying through the NSEPnet job board. They also get special hiring authorities for other federal jobs because the hardest part often about federal service is actually getting into federal service. So we try to facilitate that process for students as they come back and they begin their federal job hunt. We also have the Federal Employment Seminar, which happens every year in September. And that's where we fly students out to DC for 2 days of programming. The first day is, benefits of being a Boren, how to write a federal essay. They get to network a little bit. They get to meet some alumni. And then the second day is essentially a big hiring fair. So I think last year we had 33 or 36 agencies that came out and they were, actively interviewing, hiring, recruiting people, you know, on the spot. I did the Boren program. It's how I got my job on the NSEP service team. It's how a lot of other people I know got their first jobs in federal service. So it's not it's a great opportunity if they can come. It's not a requirement, but if your student can make it, it's definitely something that could give them an advantage in the federal job search process. Another great resource is the NSEP Alumni Association. And this is an association that is managed by other NSEP alumni, and they host events every month. Sometimes it's a social hour where it's just nice to network. They get to meet people who are maybe working in an agency or department that they're interested in, maybe even be hiring for some things. Um, or sometimes they have professional development opportunities. Like I believe this month they have a resume writing webinar that's happening. And so a really great organization to be kind of tapped into if your student is awarded a Boren Award. And then the last part is resume consulting, which is probably the most important thing for federal jobs, right? Because they're very different from private sector. They ask for a lot more information. And so the MTEP service team can kind of guide them through it. But they don't only offer that, they also offer mock job interviews. They do different webinars and things. They have virtual information and recruiting events. They recently had one for the intelligence community, which was really popular. So just thinking, what kind of support do they have, right? Because again, some people are coming from a background of not having any familiarity whatsoever with federal service. We kind of try to help curb that and give them as much information as possible to get them through that. And so for this upcoming application cycle, our deadlines for the scholarships are January 29th, 2025. And for our fellowships or our graduate students, it'll be January 22nd, 2025. And these deadlines are for programs that will begin after June 1st, 2025 and before March 1st, 2026, because in May, they will be in person, or in June, they will be in person for convocation, which is departure orientation where they get all the information of the do's and the don'ts, and the resources they have available to them while they're overseas. And then just lastly, the application timeline. So applications open in the fall, sometime in mid to late August. All applications are due by the deadline in January. We do not accept late applications. And then once notifications come out, we fly awardees to Washington, D.C. for a mandatory pre-departure orientation. This is at no cost to them, similar to the seminar. This is all funded by the Boren Awards. And then Oh, it's up and down, sorry. I read it wrong, but you guys get the gist, right? So, that's the timeline, and then after convocation, students are then free to go abroad to their programs. If they're in a FLE program, they'll start that summer in June, and then for independents, they all leave whenever their program begins. And then this is our contact information. You can send us an email. You can look at our website for more information about any part of this presentation, or you can give us a phone call. And again, please subscribe to our newsletter because that's where we post all the information about the program, things that are changing, any webinars that are coming up that may be helpful. And with that, that's all I have. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass it back to Tracy for Q&A.
Thank you, Bailey. For those of you who've been following along in the chat, you'll see that there is a lot of helpful information on further resources that have been posted by Michael, Brittany, Hannah, that should respond to some of your questions. But I'm going to take a quick look right now at a question from Beth that has been posted in the chat. And ask any of the three of you, if you want to take this on, how do you recommend advisors discuss Boren with students? And what is different about that conversation with undergraduates versus graduate students? Does Boren look as favorably upon graduate students in the humanities as in the social science fields?
Yeah, I think I can take this one. Um, so what's different, the conversations with undergraduates and graduates? Um, I think often it depends. We find that a lot of graduate students are kind of graduate students for life. And some of them kind of look forward to going back to school. And I think just what they have to make clear if they have those plans later on, and same for undergraduate students, right? Looking at graduate school. If they're looking at further education, they just need to make it clear, right? That that is just a stepping stone to then get them into federal service, and it's not something that's just kind of being put on the back burner. Um, and again, we don't have those any kind of major requirements. So all majors are weighed the same. It comes down to that national security argument and that public service argument. How are you applying your background, right? Whether you're a social sciences major or whether you're in the humanities, how do you see that being applied somewhere within the federal service? And again, that's where looking at that USA Job Board, looking at INSEPNet, that's where that's helpful because it gives them a little bit clearer idea about where they can fit in, because I think often, especially the humanities, we kind of think like, okay, there's no place for this within federal service, but I can tell you that there's definitely a job for everything within federal service. It's just more so knowing about the options available to you. So I'm gonna stress using USA Jobs a lot because it even opened again, before I was on the INSEP service team, I didn't really have a very clear understanding about what federal service was outside of, right, the armed forces and things like that, and maybe, Department of State and Defense at a very top level. But it really breaks down, and there are a lot of options available. You just, again, have to know what's out there. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And one more question, is program length considered during the selection process? What are the program length requirements for Boren? I know you have week requirements, but J term, winter term, locations where students are spending close to, but not exactly the designated amount of time in country. How does that all work?
Yeah, so that preferred length of time, it's gonna be that 6 months to a year. Doesn't matter when they do that, right? Because again, we recognize that everyone has different schedules and things at their institution. So again, as long as it falls within that after June 1st time frame and that before March 1st, 2026, as long as it's somewhere within that time frame, it doesn't really matter for us when they go abroad. They kind of have the capability to choose what time frame works best for them in their academic timeline. We're just more so worried about, the duration. In terms of like if it's not quite 4 weeks, my advice is to try to make it as close to 4 weeks, if not 4 weeks, as possible. Um, what's great is that students can stack programs. So if they find a program that doesn't quite meet, that 12 to 24 week or that 25 to 52-week mark on the dot, they can stack another program on top of it that'll put them exactly at that. So you want to try to aim for at least the minimum of one of those three options, right? So if they're a STEM undergraduate student, 8 to 11 weeks, right? So if they absolutely cannot do anything more than 8. You want them to be at 8. Same thing for 12 to 24, same thing for 25 to 52. Um, and I think that answers the question. And there is a part in there about guys on how to advise graduate students for the Boren Fellowship. Um, Again, this graduate students, they just have a lot more flexibility, so it is up to them and their program. Some programs are very pro, absolutely, you can go abroad, you don't have to worry about, any of your responsibilities here in terms of classes, dissertation, anything like that. It's different at every institution, so students just have to be very open and forthcoming about their intentions with Boren, to see if their program can accommodate. And again, like I said, they have the option to do research. They have the opportunity to do academic study so that they can at least be working on those requirements of their program, if not fulfilling them while they're abroad. Because again, oftentimes most graduate students have already been in the country. They already have some kind of familiarity with the language. So that kind of plays to their advantage, right? Where they kind of get that extra space to incorporate other things that they also need to do while they're abroad.
I think I would jump in and just say, as an academic advisor, somebody who is going to likely be writing the campus evaluation or even a letter of recommendation, uh, it takes a village, right? The letters of recommendation, the campus evaluation, they should all be basically heading in the same direction. Are we all on the same page? And in this case, when it comes to a graduate student, uh, it's reaffirming or reassuring the committee. It says this graduate student has, this is a perfectly feasible and doable program that the school is in full support of. And if those graduate students that want to do a research component, they have an essay to add. They have a 250 words, I think, to add to that about the research. Common questions we get for research applications. Is the school even going to let them do that? I don't see anywhere where it shows they have permission to do interviews, or I don't think they have the language skills to do these interviews, even if they had permission. Really look at the flexibility and the feasibility of the applicant. And you probably have heard this if you have been if you've been a advisor. Sorry, my cat's trying to take over. If you've been an advisor before, one of the worst things you can hear from a committee is, I think the letters of recommendation, or I think the campus evaluation did a better job explaining why this student needs a Boren than the student did. We hear that every year. So that is also something to look out.
Yeah. Yep, that is an ongoing problem frequently. It's the benefit of the maturity, right, of faculty members and advisors, who can often see the forest through the trees better than the students can. Here is a question from Anne. Would a student who's already admitted to grad school be able to study both the language and courses related to their home university degree program, especially if they've not been abroad before? So student gets accepted to anthropology, gets the Boren grad program in anthropology. Can the student take courses that they can then, that are relevant to their program back at home?
I can jump in, but Michael, I also, if I don't hit a point, I welcome you to jump in as well. So this kind of comes down to language proficiency, and this is kind of where it's looked at a little bit more closely because, again, if a student, because ideally, if they're abroad and they're taking classes related to their major, it is in the target language. We don't want them taking any classes in English. And so that's kind of the feasibility piece that comes in. Can this applicant actually go abroad and take these classes related to their major in their target language? And then that brings up also another barrier of, whether or not those credits through their program or through that institution will transfer back. And again, these are all things that they will have to check prior to, or that I highly recommend checking prior to, applying for a specific institution or program. But that's the bulk of it. I would say that, it's gonna come down to the feasibility of it, and their experience in the language and their proficiency in the language. Um,
I can jump in a little bit. If we have, because we do say on our website, we just said it, they said it, and it's perfectly true. We will take somebody who has zero background in the language. Now, that said, let's say I'm a sophomore. I'm applying for the Boren. I've never studied Japanese before. I'm going to Amayama Gakuen, and the study abroad program through my school has English classes because I've never studied Japanese. I'm taking 4 classes. 2 are in Japanese language, vocabulary, grammar, kanji, what have you. But 2 are in English, but it's Japanese culture, Japanese history, Japanese whatever, economics. And obviously my Japanese is then at a level where I can take those in English. Does that look bad on my application? It's going to be in the breakdown of what the program is when you attach in the application a copy of what you're going to be doing overseas. There is a place where students have to put that in. What I think you have to do then is emphasize the language over everything else. Don't go in the essays, don't talk about those English classes because it's really not going to help your cause. Talk more about the language, talk about the things you're doing on top of your official classes. So I'm doing 8 hours of Japanese through the official channel, doing the 4-hour, 4 credit classes. But I'm also having a language program. I have asked to do a homestay, or I'm living with a Japanese roommate. I will be taking tutoring on the side, and I'm really emphasizing language in my application because the English I can't get away from. It's what my school is going to have me do. But understood, and this is also something where the campus evaluation can come in and say, this program has Japanese, has English, but this is really a Japanese focused program. You're really selling the language to the committee. Just, it's know your audience kind of deal there.
Right. So here's a question about what makes an applicant stand out to the reviewers. I'm sure there are lots of things that can do that, but you have some advice about how to make your application really stand out.
Yeah, I'd definitely say, right. So nailing that big national security piece, I think that's where a lot of students um kind of lose focus or where they're not as strong. Because often what tends to happen is that instead of arguing why, that national security issue is important for the United States, they often just kind of talk about why this is a national security issue, but for the country they're traveling to. And so just kind of really harping on that national security issue that they choose should be a national security issue for the United States, and also connecting right the language, the location, as well into that national security issue and then their background. And then same thing for that federal service essay. We get a lot of people who, they say, oh, well, I would like to be an analyst in the federal government, but that could be so many things depending on, what agency or department you're in. So again, looking for that specificity and that clarity and what their plan is for federal service instead of just kind of generally throwing something out that sounds good. And again, even if it's right, not one of those tier 1 agencies, right? So Department of Defense, State, Intelligence Community, USAID, Homeland Security, right? If it's one of those tier 2, if it lines up with their national security argument, their academic background, right? And they have a clear, feasible plan. You're looking at a pretty strong essay. And then also in addition, right, Michael emphasized the recommendation letters and also making sure that the recommendation letters reflect everything that the student is saying, right? So we're not looking for a recommendation letter that just says, oh, well, Hannah, she's such a great student and she's more than deserving of this award, right? We're looking for Hannah's a great student that comes from this background and she has this interest in this language and this country because of said national security issue, abroad. And they are more than capable, she's more than capable of going abroad and immersing herself in the culture and coming back and giving back to the federal government. That's what we're looking for, right? So that echoing, that specificity, that clarity. And if an application has those things, it's a pretty solid application. But I'll turn it over to Michael and Hannah for any other thoughts that I may have missed.
Michael, Hannah, do you have anything you want to add?
I think Bailey covered it pretty well. I think another thing that reviewers mentioned of just being in that federal service essay, being realistic about their federal service and showing that you've done research of a common thing many students want to be foreign service officers in the State Department. That's not very likely for a 22-year-old undergraduate that's just graduated college. So I think just being realistic, you can absolutely be a foreign service officer, but kind of detailing more of a plan to get there, showing that you kind of look through USA jobs like Bailey had mentioned, and that you do have some sort of idea more specific of what you would want to do. Not that anyone is going to hold you to it. People change, careers change, goals change all the time, but just a more specific, thought out plan versus I'm going to be a congressman or a foreign service officer for my service requirement, and showing that kind of greater dedication to federal service longer than just 1 year.
Great, thank you. Another question from Lauren Dropkin. Who writes letters of recommendation other than language professors? Do you notice any patterns? And Lauren expresses some concern about this because it might not be common for someone to have a strong connection with 2 or 3 of those professors in the same department other than in the foreign language departments of their schools.
Yeah, so just to clarify, so language professors was specific for those language proficiency evaluations, which are separate from letters of recommendation. We recommend language professors for those language proficiency evaluations. So if a student has a professor from another department or from a previous intern experience or a previous employment opportunity that they'd like to use, as long as, again, they can speak to those qualities that we're looking for in Boren, it's totally fine to go outside that scope of their department, or what their major is. I just wanted to clarify that that language professor was specific for the language proficiency evaluation and not necessarily language. The letters of recommendation, though we do often see language professors also write letters of recommendation. If you are the assigned campus representative for Boren, you're also a good person to write a letter of recommendation just because, again, you're familiar with the program. And if you've been working with this, but we often see that with campus reps that work heavily with the student during the process of writing their applications. And so you're also another good person to write letters of recommendation. But again, it could be anyone that can speak right to who the student is and their interest in federal service, and studying a critical language overseas.
And I'll jump in because I've been on NAPAs and other organizations like this one where that is an interesting argument, or maybe a philosophy. Should the person who's writing the campus evaluation also be somebody who writes a letter of recommendation? And I definitely see that conversation happening every year for various awards like Fulbright, Boren, CLS, and things like that. It depends on what you want to do. We no longer ask for a grade, like a rating from the campus evaluation. We stopped doing that a couple of years ago, and the idea was it didn't make any sense. We just need you to answer those questions. And reality is that is basically another recommendation. But for some of you, you may have a student who goes through all on their own, and then you find out on the campus rep portal that you have this student who's applying for Boren or is about to apply for Boren, and you need to do an evaluation because it's the application deadline is passed. Here are the people that have submitted applications for your school, and you're like, I have no idea who John Doe is. That very well means you just write in the box did not meet with students, and that's perfectly fine. It's not going to hurt the student. What hurt the student is, student never replied to my calls. Students skipped my advising session. Good luck. Obviously there are some advisors who would be happy to write that, and some advisors who don't want to, torpedo an applicant. But it is something that if you have questions about and you're like, is this appropriate? Is this something I should do? Please let me know. The other thing to go bounce back on what Bailey was saying, and I think this is true, if a student in October knows that they're going to apply for Boren and the deadline is end of January, the professors they're going to work with, even if they just met them, it may be a good idea. I was a former teacher, and I had office hours at Maryland, and one of the things that the loneliest times of my life, this is before internet, but the loneliest times of my life were the office hour I dedicated every week. I generally spent playing Scrabble or something because nobody came. Students should be taking advantage of this, and I don't know how students are, 25 years later, but in my opinion, it probably hasn't changed all that much. So these students should take advantage, say, hey, I'm interested in this award. This is what I was thinking would be my SA1. This is what I'm thinking about kind of job that people in our major do. What do you think? Get their information. Later come to them for the evaluation. Then they know more about Boren. They know more about you, your motivation, and they're going to write a better letter for it.
Yeah, I think that's helpful advice for any letters of recommendation. You get them from the people who know you and your work the best, and they're going to say the nicest things and represent your work and your interests in the right way. A question came in. Am I correct to assume that students who have been pathway interns should include that in their essays as applicable?
Absolutely. Any previous experience that speaks to, their interest in federal service or their interest in language, they should talk about, right? Because again, it's one of those things where it can only help them. Again, especially as a pathway intern, if they've been working with an agency, then that interest kind of flows throughout, from before Boren to now to Boren and then after Boren. So absolutely.
And students that have been pages, people who I don't know if they do that anymore in Congress, it's students that have worked for their state government. I get this question usually once a year. Should I worry because I was a student volunteer in this person's office and they are on either Team Red or Team Blue, right? And they're worried that it's going to make them look bad one way or the other. And it's funny because both, it doesn't matter which one, both people think that they're in trouble. If they mention which office they work for, it does not. We are nonpartisan. We are all 50 states plus territories apply for Boren. we definitely don't want to say someone shouldn't apply just based on where maybe they worked or the type of school they go to. All of that is, I want people to apply from everywhere, from all walks of life, and I don't want someone to feel like they're at a disadvantage just based on who they are, where they worked, or where they go to school.
Right. Great, thank you. If you have any other questions, please put them in the chat right now. I would invite everybody to go through the chat. There's lots of helpful information, lots of helpful links. And of course, the first place to get started is by going to the Boren website. I assume that would be the way to get started, where there's a lot of information. There's contact information for the folks here today and probably for other folks as well. The application process is, I assume, explained also on the website. There's a question about step-by-step that has been covered to some extent here in today's presentation. And of course, that information is also available on the website. So if there are no other questions today, I would like to close just by inviting you all to attend future webinars like this one for APSIA advisors. The next one's going to be on July 31st, and it will offer information about the Public Policy and International Affairs Program, or PPIA, which has a pipeline program to help undergraduates better understand their career options in public policy and international affairs. I'd like to invite our guest today, today, especially Bailey for the presentation, and also Michael and Hannah for being on hand to do to some heavy lifting with the questions, the Q&A. And a special shout out, of course, to Brittany Chor, the APSIA's Constituent Relations and Communications Coordinator, who has organized this and other such webinars. So thank you for your hard work behind the scenes, Brittany. We couldn't do any of this without you. And so I will bid you all a very good afternoon until next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.